I caught my husband cheating. It's not something many people actually witness firsthand. Most would probably discover their partner's infidelity by finding suspicious messages on their phone. But I saw it with my own eyes, in a place and at a time I never expected, with so many people around to witness it, too. I'd always had my doubts about their relationship, but I never imagined I'd catch my husband cheating so publicly. My name is Christina, and I'm a stay-at-home mom to our 6-year-old son. The day I saw my husband's betrayal, he had the day off, and we had plans to spend it together as a family, but when I woke up, he was already gone. I received a text from him saying, "I'm taking care of my sister, who's running a fever of 102 degrees. No one else is around, so I'll be back this evening." I let out a heavy sigh. I had promised our son we'd go to the amusement park, and he'd been excited about it since the day before. My husband had been swamped with a major project at work and hadn't taken a break in 6 months. This was supposed to be a rare chance for us to be together, but instead, he chose to tend to his sister. She has a fiancé, so she wasn't exactly alone, but my husband has always had a thing for his sister. In fact, he once told me he started dating me because I reminded him of her, which made me uneasy from the start. I'd met his sister a long time ago. She's beautiful and kind, so maybe looking like her was the highest compliment he could give me, but it still creeped me out. My husband used to say, "I want a boy and a girl," and he was the one who often initiated intimacy, but after our son was born, things changed. Now, there's nothing. We're still young, and he used to enjoy sex, so I can't help but wonder if he's finding it somewhere else. It's one thing to feel betrayed, that's bad enough, but what really hurts is how he just disappears on his days off, like today. Would it kill him to spend time with our child once in a while? Our son adores him and cries whenever he realizes his dad isn't around. My husband is so distant from our child. He doesn't even bother with birthday gifts or school events, no matter how much free time he has. Sometimes he comes home early, but then he just locks himself in his room and plays games non-stop. He barely even looks at our son anymore. I'm worried that soon, our little boy, who used to idolize his father, will start to see him as a stranger. And about that big project he's supposedly working on, it's all a lie, because he was rarely home. I reached out to an old classmate who works at the same company and asked, "Is my husband really that busy?" They laughed and said, "Busy? No way. He's basically a windowside employee. He barely has any work and always seems bored. He clocks out on time every day." That confirmed what I already suspected. He claimed to be handling a major project, but his salary stayed the same, and he never looked worn out from long hours. In fact, he seemed more well-rested than ever. All of this made me more certain that he was cheating. With a heavy heart, I finished preparing breakfast, but something felt off. I checked the time, it was past 7 a.m., and my son still wasn't up. Normally, he'd be awake by now, even without me having to nudge him. If we didn't hurry, he'd miss the nursery school bus, so I rushed to his room to wake him. When I entered, he was still sound asleep. I gently tried to rouse him, saying, "It's morning, time to wake up." Instead of the usual sleepy response, I was met with a painful groan. My concern grew as I reached out to touch his face and felt his forehead. It was burning hot. I called his name and lightly shook his shoulder. He barely opened his eyes and whispered, "Mom, I can't breathe." Panic washed over me. There had been an outbreak of illness at his nursery school, and I couldn't help but think, could it be that my son has caught it too? I'd heard stories of children succumbing to it, and for a moment, I feared the worst. In desperation, I tried calling my husband, but he didn't answer. I didn't have time to wait for a reply to a message, so I reached out to my mother for advice. She's a nurse, so I knew she'd know what to do. Following her clear instructions, I quickly prepared an ice pillow and took my son's temperature. It was over 102 degrees Fahrenheit. I called for an ambulance and made sure my son drank plenty of water while we waited. My mother mentioned the possibility of heat stroke, so I took every precaution. Due to the risk of infection, I wasn't allowed to ride in the ambulance with him, so I called a taxi to follow them to the hospital. During this time, I kept trying to reach my husband, though I knew it was probably in vain. As expected, he didn't respond. With no other choice, I left a message online, hoping he'd see it and come if he cared enough. When I arrived at the hospital, I waited anxiously in the hallway outside the emergency treatment room, silently praying for my son's recovery. Memories of my father being taken into an emergency room and never coming out alive haunted me. What if my son doesn't make it either? I couldn't stop the terrible thoughts from creeping in. My mother, who had come to support me, gently reassured me, "It'll be okay, it'll be okay." An hour later, the doctor informed us that my son was stable, though they recommended he stay hospitalized for a week. As he was moved to a hospital room, I realized my husband hadn't come home that day. The next morning, I returned home to gather some clothes and decided to bring my son some fruit as a get-well gift. I thought I'd stop by the emergency room to thank the doctor who had helped us, but as I approached, the area suddenly became chaotic. Someone was being rushed in. Not wanting to get in the way, I decided to postpone my thanks and head to my son's room. That's when I noticed a man and a woman being wheeled in on a stretcher. They were barely covered with a thin blanket and seemed almost naked. It looked like they were still joined together, probably stuck during intercourse. I'd never experienced anything like that, but it must be mortifying to be brought in like that. As I tried to pass by, I accidentally made eye contact with the man. Under normal circumstances, it would have been awkward, but this was different. I froze, realizing the man was my husband. "What are you doing here?" I blurted out in shock. Well, I caught my sister's cold and, my husband stammered, clearly struggling for an explanation. I was utterly confused. How could my husband be here, naked and in this situation, just a day after our son was admitted, and who was the woman with him? My mind raced with questions, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. When I made eye contact with the woman my husband was with, I instantly recognized her as his affair partner. Despite my shock, her face looked oddly familiar. Then I heard her voice, and it hit me. She was my husband's sister, Brenna. The moment felt like it was unfolding in slow motion. I had suspected my husband was lying about caring for his sister and meeting someone else, but I never imagined he'd be caught in such a scandalous situation. It was bad enough that he'd been away from our son, but to find him in this compromising position with his own sister was beyond belief. As they were being wheeled away on a stretcher, I had to restrain myself from confronting them. There would be time for that later. For now, I needed to focus on my son, which was why I had come to the hospital in the first place. With a sick feeling churning in my stomach, I spent some time with him, trying to manage my emotions. When I checked my phone, I found dozens of messages from my husband. True to form, they were all attempts to cover his tracks and didn't mention our son's hospitalization at all. I decided to ignore him and waited for another hour. The doctor who had treated my son the day before finally came to see me. He smiled reassuringly and said, "Your son is doing very well. He's recovering faster than we anticipated. His fever has dropped, and his condition has stabilized. Initially, we were concerned about an infection, but it turned out he had heat stroke along with a cold. You did the right thing by making sure he drank plenty of water. Your son must be proud to have such a caring mother." I knew the credit for this largely went to my own mother. I promised myself I'd thank her properly with a special gift next time. I bowed deeply to the doctor, expressing my gratitude, but the relief I felt about my son's health was overshadowed by the anger brewing inside me. "Mama's face is scary," my son remarked, frightened by my demeanor. I quickly forced a smile and told him, "I'll be back soon." Leaving the hospital, I called my husband, who had over 100 missed calls. As soon as he answered, he began to make excuses. "It wasn't what it looked like. There's an explanation," he started. It was clear he had his priorities completely wrong. Shouldn't he be more concerned about our son? A man who could get so caught up in an act with his own sister while neglecting his child clearly wasn't fit to be a reliable partner or parent. With his behavior showing no signs of improvement, I decided that divorce was the best option. It would be difficult, but it was necessary for the sake of my son's well-being and future. "So, you were busy with that even while our son was suffering? I suppose you made time for it whenever you had a free moment, and with your own sister. That's just repulsive," I said. He was at a loss for words. I continued, "By the way, I've already informed your parents about this. I'm not going to tell your company, though. It would be a problem if you couldn't pay alimony and child support. So, this is goodbye." With that, I delivered my final words to my husband. 3 days later, my son's health had improved faster than anticipated. so I completed the discharge procedures and took him home. Naturally, my husband wasn't there. He later came to my home to apologize in person, but I handed him the divorce papers I had already signed. He pleaded for forgiveness, saying, "This was the first time. Please forgive me for just this one mistake. You're all I have." In a cold voice, I responded, "You're still lying. I know everything now." Your sister confessed it all. Knowing he wouldn't easily accept the divorce, I had prepared a strategy to ensure he wouldn't cause trouble. I first approached his sister, who had been involved in the affair. "Dear sister-in-law, I heard you're planning to have a wedding ceremony with your fiancé soon. Congratulations." "Ah, thank you. I wanted to send a congratulatory message, but I came up with an interesting story instead. Would you like to hear it?" "You're not planning to expose this, are you?" "Yes, I want everyone to know what kind of person you are. It will be clear and decisive," I said with a smirk. "Please don't do that, it would ruin my life." Feigning contemplation, I replied with a smile, "Well, I suppose I have no choice. How about this? I'll keep quiet if you tell me exactly how many times you and my husband were together. Then I'll stay silent. Of course, your brother will still feel betrayed. What will you do?" Without hesitation, she confessed everything. "Please don't tell him. I'll tell you everything," she said, quickly divulging the details. When I relayed this information to my husband, he was devastated by the betrayal from the sister he cherished most. After regaining his composure, he signed the divorce papers and left the house, heartbroken. I then went through a lawyer to finalize the divorce, seek custody of our son, and demand alimony and child support. Initially, he tried to negotiate, but when I whispered, "Do you want me to?" he quickly agreed to the amount I requested. He left the lawyer's office with a resigned look. After the incident, word got out at my husband's company, leading to his severe reprimand. Within a month, he was fired and now works at a food factory, placing strawberries on cakes to cover alimony and child support. Surprisingly, the factory workers know about his past, and he's become the subject of gossip, particularly among the younger employees, which makes him feel extremely uncomfortable. As for his sister, despite my efforts to keep the details private, the whole scandal was eventually exposed. Her engagement was called off after her ex-fiancé hired a private investigator who uncovered the affair. She faced a substantial compensation demand for the broken engagement and now works at a nightclub. Recently, her ex-boyfriend gave me a photo of them together, saying, "Use it if you need to." While I was taken aback by his audacity, I decided to keep the photo in case my husband tries to contact me or cause trouble. I'll hold on to it as a precaution. I moved back to my parents' house for a fresh start, and they've been incredibly supportive in helping me raise my son. Although my parents live far away and miss seeing their grandson often, they've offered all the assistance they can. I'm mindful not to rely on them too much, only asking for help when necessary. Since his high fever, my son has been in excellent health and has received awards for perfect attendance at school for 3 years straight. It's heartening to see him so happy and to know he has seemingly forgotten about his biological father. I almost forgot to mention our new addition, Angel, the white cat who now snuggles comfortably on my lap. When I went to say goodbye to Angel, who frequently visited my yard, he jumped into my lap and stayed there. I was too attached to part with him, so I brought him to my parents' house. Now, Angel is just as important to me as my son, and he's grown close to my parents. As I sit in the rocking chair on the porch, gently stroking Angel, I reflect on how I want to enjoy watching my son grow up with my parents and our beloved cat by our side. This is the life I'm building, and it fills me with contentment.